The story of Napoleon Bonaparte is a truth more spectacular than any fiction. He was a man who rose from an obscure island to redefine the borders of the world. To understand the emperor, we must first understand the void he filled. France in 1789 was a powder keg of inequality and starvation. The old world was burning. The guillotine's blade became the rhythmic heartbeat of Paris, claiming the heads of kings and commoners alike. In this vacuum of power, the traditional rules of birthright were erased by the cold steel of meritocracy. Born in 1769 on the island of Corsica, just months after it became French, Napoleon was an outsider from birth. He was a boy of modest nobility, sent to the military schools of the mainland where he was mocked for his accent. But while others played, Napoleon studied. He devoured the campaigns of Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. His first real taste of glory came at the siege of Toulon in 1793. As a captain of artillery, he realized that by seizing a single promontory, he could force the British fleet to flee the harbor. He slept among his guns and let the bayonet charge himself. When the British fleet retreated in flames, the world realized that a new kind of soldier had arrived. At 24, he was promoted to brigadier general. But in revolutionary France, the higher you rose, the closer you were to the guillotine. After the fall of the radicals, Napoleon found himself in a Parisian jail, destitute and forgotten. Fortune intervened in 1795. A royalist mob threatened the government. Napoleon didn't hesitate. He gave the mob a whiff of grape shot. In an hour, the rebellion was dead. In a day, Napoleon was the savior of the Republic. Before he could conquer Italy, he was conquered by Josephine de Beauharnais. He was madly in love while she was looking for security. They married in haste, and 2 days later, he left to lead the army of Italy. In 1796, he arrived to find an army that was starving and shoeless. He told them, "I will lead you into the most fertile plains in the world. There you will find honor, glory, and riches." In 1 year, he destroyed 4 Austrian armies. He reinvented warfare, using speed and maneuvers that made the old rules obsolete. At the Bridge of Lodi, he proved he was a soldier's general. By 1797, Napoleon had dictated peace to Austria. He returned to Paris as the most famous man in France, but Europe was too small. He looked to the east, seeking to strike at Britain's heart by seizing Egypt. In the shadow of the pyramids, he faced the Mameluke cavalry. He told his troops, "Soldiers, from the tops of these pyramids, 40 centuries look down upon you." The Mamelukes broke against the French squares. While Napoleon won on land, Admiral Nelson found the French fleet at anchor. In a single night at Aboukir Bay, Napoleon's dream of an Eastern Empire was sunk. Trapped, he slipped past the British blockade to return home. The coup of 18 Brumaire in 1799 was a desperate gamble. With the help of his brother Lucien, the old government was abolished. Napoleon was named first consul, the absolute ruler of France. He created the Bank of France, modernized education, and established the Napoleonic Code. He was the enlightened despot, bringing order to the chaos of the revolution. The peace of 1802 was merely a breathing space. While the Treaty of Amiens briefly silenced the guns, the British remained wary of Napoleon's growing influence in Italy and Switzerland. War was not a matter of if but when. But Napoleon used this time to consolidate his power at home. He purged his political enemies and tightened his grip on the press. To Napoleon, order was the highest virtue, and the chaos of the revolution had to be tamed at any cost. In the Caribbean, Napoleon faced his first major setback, the slave revolt in Saint-Domingue, led by Toussaint Louverture, defied French control. Napoleon sent a massive expedition, but yellow fever decimated his troops. Realizing he could not defend his North American territories while at war with Britain, Napoleon sold the Louisiana Territory to the United States for $15 million, doubling the size of the young American nation. In 1804, a royalist plot to assassinate the first consul was uncovered. Napoleon's response was swift and ruthless. He ordered the kidnapping and execution of the Duke of Enghien, a member of the Bourbon family. With the Bourbons silenced, and the people yearning for stability, the path to the throne was clear. On May 18, 1804, the Senate declared Napoleon the Emperor of the French. The Republic was over. The Empire had begun. The coronation was a spectacle of unparalleled ego. Napoleon spent millions on jewels, robes, and music. He wanted to show the world that a new dynasty had arrived, one born of merit and iron, not ancient blood. Pope Pius VII was brought from Rome to lend divine legitimacy. But Napoleon made it clear who the true master was. By crowning himself, he signaled that his power was his own, independent of the church. Next, he crowned Josephine. It was a rare moment of public tenderness for a man who usually projected an image of cold calculation. For a brief moment, the emperor and empress were the center of the world. The world outside the cathedral was less celebratory. In London, William Pitt the Younger viewed Napoleon's coronation as a declaration of total war. The Third Coalition was already being funded by British gold. Napoleon gathered 2,000 ships at the camp of Boulogne for an invasion of England. He waited for his admirals to control the channel for just 6 hours, enough time to change the world. But the French admirals were no match for the Royal Navy. While Napoleon waited, the Austrian and Russian armies began to move in the east. He was forced to abandon the invasion and turn his back on England. What followed was one of the most incredible marches in history. The Grande Armée moved with a speed that left their enemies stunned. Napoleon didn't just move soldiers, he moved a machine of war. At Ulm, Napoleon's maneuver was so perfect that he captured 60,000 Austrians without a major battle. He had surrounded them before they even realized he was there. It was a triumph of geometry over brawn. But the celebration was cut short. At Cape Trafalgar, Admiral Nelson cornered the combined French and Spanish fleets. It was the battle that would decide who ruled the sea for the next century. Nelson broke the traditional line of battle, piercing the heart of the French fleet. He was shot during the fight, but as he lay dying, he knew the victory was his. Trafalgar meant Napoleon was a prisoner on the continent. But on land, he was still the master. He turned his attention to the Russians and the remaining Austrians at a place called Austerlitz. Napoleon knew he was outnumbered. He played on the arrogance of the Tsar, making himself look weak and desperate. He abandoned the high ground of the Pratzen Heights, luring the Allies into a trap. As the Russians moved south, they left their center exposed. Napoleon waited for the mist to rise, and then he launched his strike. Marshal Soult's corps surged up the heights, snapping the Allied line in two. Thousands of Russians drowned as they tried to flee across the frozen Sachin ponds. Napoleon ordered his cannons to fire at the ice. It was a ruthless, total victory. The Third Coalition was dead. The son of Austerlitz became a symbol of his destiny. He was now the arbiter of Europe, redrawing the map at will. He abolished the Holy Roman Empire and replaced it with the Confederation of the Rhine. Prussia, which had stayed neutral, now found itself surrounded. In 1806, they declared war on Napoleon alone. It was a mistake they would pay for in blood at the twin battles of Jena and Auerstedt. The Prussian army, once the terror of Europe, was destroyed in a single day. Napoleon entered Berlin in triumph. He stood before the tomb of Frederick the Great and said, "If he were alive, we would not be here." From Berlin, Napoleon issued the Berlin Decree. This was the birth of the continental system. He forbade any trade with Great Britain, attempting to destroy the nation of shopkeepers through economic warfare. But Russia was still in the fight. Napoleon marched into the frozen marshes of Poland. At Eylau, in a blinding snowstorm, he faced the Russians in one of the most brutal battles of his career. He watched as 10,000 of his cavalrymen, led by Marshal Murat, charged through the Russian lines to save his center. It was the largest cavalry charge in history, a wall of steel and horseflesh. Eylau was a stalemate, but in the summer of 1807 he finally caught the Russians at Friedland. He pinned them against a river and used his artillery to turn the battle into a slaughter. The Tsar had had enough. He met Napoleon on a grand raft in the middle of the Niemen River. At Tilsit, they divided Europe between them, with Russia agreeing to join the blockade of Britain. Napoleon returned to Paris as the master of the continent. But he was obsessed with legacy. He needed an heir, and Josephine, the love of his life, could not give him one. The divorce was heartbreaking. Napoleon told her, "It is for the sake of France." As he signed the papers, tears were seen in his eyes. He was sacrificing his happiness for the survival of his empire. He married Marie-Louise of Austria, a cold political union. When she finally gave him a son, the King of Rome, Napoleon believed his dynasty was secure. While the emperor celebrated, the foundations were cracking. In Spain, the people refused to accept his brother Joseph as king. What began as an occupation turned into a nightmare. The guerrilla. Napoleon called it the Spanish ulcer. The Spanish people fought from the shadows, in the mountains, and in the streets. No Frenchman was safe. The British sent Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, to lead an army in Portugal. He was a master of defensive warfare and would become the thorn in Napoleon's side. By 1811, the alliance with Russia was failing. Tsar Alexander was tired of the continental system, which was ruining his economy. He reopened his ports, and Napoleon saw it as a declaration of war. Napoleon gathered the Grande Armée, 600,000 men from across Europe, and began the long march into the heart of Russia. As they crossed the Niemen River, the Russians retreated. They didn't fight, they burned. Napoleon found only empty villages and blackened fields. The heat of the Russian summer was as deadly as the winter. Thousands died of typhus and exhaustion before they saw a Russian soldier. Napoleon was losing 5,000 men a day just to the environment. He was desperate for a battle. Finally, the Russians stood at Borodino. It was a meat grinder. The two armies pounded each other with artillery for 15 hours. Napoleon won, but at a cost of 30,000 of his best men. Napoleon entered Moscow, believing the Tsar would surrender. But Moscow was a ghost town. The next night, fires broke out. The Russians had burned their own capital rather than let him have it. Napoleon waited in the Kremlin for 5 weeks. No reply came from the Tsar. On October 19th, with general winter approaching, he finally ordered the retreat. It was far too late. It turned into a struggle for survival. The Russians watched as cold and hunger did their work. The Grande Armée was becoming a column of walking corpses. Cossacks struck at the edges of the column. The French had to eat their own horses to stay alive. Discipline dissolved into animal instinct. The climax was the Berezina River. The bridges were broken and the army was trapped. Thousands drowned or were crushed in the panic. The river became a mass grave. Napoleon abandoned the army and raced back to Paris to raise a new one. But the secret was out. The invincible emperor had been beaten. In 1813, Prussia and Austria joined Russia to finish him. At Leipzig, the Battle of the Nations, Napoleon faced 300,000 allies with only 170,000 men. After 3 days of fighting, he was defeated. His empire was shrinking by the hour. In 1814, the Allies crossed the Rhine. Napoleon fought a defensive campaign in France, winning 5 battles in 5 days with a tiny army. It was his most brilliant and desperate work. But Paris was captured. His own marshals told him it was over. Napoleon abdicated at Fontainebleau and was exiled to the island of Elba. In February 1815, he escaped. He landed in southern France and began the march to Paris. When the 5th Regiment was sent to stop him, Napoleon stepped forward, opened his coat, and dared them to shoot their emperor. The soldiers shouted, "Vive l'Empereur!" and joined him. The march became a parade. King Louis XVI fled, and the eagle returned to the Tuileries Palace. This was the start of the 100 Days. The Allies declared him an enemy of world peace. Napoleon marched into Belgium to strike before they could unite. At Ligny, he defeated the Prussians, but they retreated in good order. At Waterloo, Duke Wellington held a ridge. Napoleon was delayed by mud, waiting for the ground to dry for his artillery. It was a delay that would cost him everything. The French cavalry charged the British squares again and again, but the redcoats held firm. As the sun set, the Prussians arrived on the French flank. In a final act of desperation, Napoleon sent in his old guard. They were repulsed for the first time in history. The cry, "La garde recule," sent the army into a panicked rout. Napoleon abdicated a second time and surrendered to the British. They sent him to St. Helena, a volcanic rock in the South Atlantic. It was a prison from which there was no escape. While the wars were over, the world of art and culture had been transformed. Napoleon established the empire style, drawing from ancient Rome to project eternal authority. He saw himself as a modern Augustus. Paris was to become the new Rome. He transformed the Louvre into the greatest museum on earth to house the treasures of his conquests. Despite his focus on the grand, Napoleon was obsessed with the minute. He was known to memorize the exact number of shoes in his warehouses. His mind was a living ledger. This attention to detail extended to the dinner table. Napoleon was famously a fast eater, often finishing a multi-course imperial meal in less than 15 minutes. His relationship with his family was a constant source of stress. He placed his brothers on thrones, but they often proved incompetent, caring more for their new titles than for France. His brother Louis, King of Holland, defied the blockade. Napoleon eventually had to send an army to annex his own brother's kingdom. Then there was the constant threat of assassination. He survived the infernal machine plot in 1800, where a wagon bomb exploded seconds after his carriage had passed. He used these attempts to justify a secret police, led by the devious Joseph Fouché. This network ensured that dissent was crushed before it could breathe. Yet Napoleon was a man of the people. He frequently traveled incognito, asking peasants about their crops and taxes to hear the truth his ministers hid. The scientific world also flourished. Napoleon funded the discovery of the battery and studies of paleontology, wanting his reign to be a second renaissance. In the military, he introduced the meritocracy of the knapsack. Every soldier carried a marshal's baton in his pack, meaning anyone could rise to the top. But the wars were eating the youth of France. The Marie-Louise, the young conscripts of 1813, were often just boys, barely trained, and forced into the meat grinder. Logistics remained his greatest challenge. In the vast spaces of Russia, the supply lines were stretched to the breaking point. The Grande Armée was a moving city that needed to eat. Napoleon's health began to decline. He suffered from chronic skin conditions and the early stages of the stomach cancer that would eventually kill him. By 1813, the Allies had learned his secrets. They avoided fighting Napoleon directly, instead attacking his marshals, who struggled with independent command. His marshals were exhausted. Men like Davout and Masséna had been fighting for 20 years. They wanted to enjoy their wealth, not freeze in the mud. At the Battle of Dresden, he won his last great victory on German soil. But it was hollow. He could not be everywhere at once. The 1814 campaign of France was a masterpiece of desperation. Defending his own soil, Napoleon was more lethal than ever, but he was fighting with a ghost of an army. When the Allies reached Paris, the city surrendered. Napoleon was at Fontainebleau when his generals staged a mutiny. The bravest of the brief had had enough. His first exile on Elba was a strange interlude. He became the governor of a tiny island, building roads for a population of 10,000, while his mind remained on millions. The Congress of Vienna was redrawing the world, the victors were squabbling, and the French people were already missing the glory of the empire. His escape from Elba relied on charisma. He knew the soldiers sent to kill him were the same men he had led to victory for 20 years. The 100 Days was a romantic tragedy. Napoleon returned to the Tuileries, but he was an outlaw in the eyes of Europe. He had to win or die. At Ligny, he defeated the Prussians, but his failure to destroy them would haunt him just 48 hours later at Waterloo. The morning of Waterloo was soaked in rain. Napoleon was in pain, suffering from a bout of hemorrhoids that made it difficult to stay in the saddle. Wellington stood behind the crest of a ridge, protected from artillery, and told his men to lie down until the French were within 50 yards. The charge of the French cavalry was a sight of terrifying beauty. 5,000 horses thundering across the mud, but unable to break the British squares. As the Prussians appeared, Napoleon sent in the old guard. They marched slowly in perfect formation, but for the first time, they were repulsed. The cry of "the guard retreats" sent a shockwave through the army. The collapse was total. Napoleon stood on the field, watching his dreams crumble. He returned to Paris and abdicated a second time. He hoped to escape to America, but the British Navy blocked every port. He surrendered to the HMS Bellerophon. The British sent him to St. Helena. It was a sentence of slow, isolated death on a rock 1,200 miles from any coast. On the island, he was under surveillance by Sir Hudson Lowe, a petty bureaucrat who insisted on calling him General Bonaparte. It was a war of small insults. He spent his final years gardening and reading. He wrote his memoirs as a manifesto, ensuring that Napoleonic legend would outlive him. His death in 1821 was quiet. The man who had survived 1,000 battles died in a bed. He was 51 years old. His body was buried under a simple stone. The British refused to let the word emperor be carved upon it, but the legend grew. In 1840, Napoleon's body was returned to Paris. It was the greatest funeral the city had ever seen. He was laid to rest at Les Invalides. His tomb is designed so that anyone who looks at it must bow their head, a final gesture of respect. Napoleon's influence is everywhere, from the legal systems of Europe to the metric system. He swept away the medieval world and paved the way for the modern age. He was a man of contradictions, a child of the Enlightenment, who became an absolute ruler. The eagle is gone, but the shadow he cast still looms over the world. History may be a set of lies, but Napoleon Bonaparte remains the greatest truth of his age. This was the most brilliant strategist the world has ever seen. His administrative genius was codified in the Council of State, a body of experts that bypassed traditional politics. He standardized weights and measures, giving the world the metric system. He was a master of propaganda, turning every skirmish into a legendary victory. Napoleon understood the power of the image. In Egypt, his savants discovered the Rosetta Stone, providing the key to unlocking the secrets of ancient Egypt. He re-established the Catholic Church with the Concordat of 1801, but on his terms. His elite Imperial Guard was the final reserve of the army. To join, one had to be a veteran of multiple campaigns. Napoleon's system of honors, including the Legion of Honor, created a new nobility based on service. While he fought kings, he maintained a court that was more lavish than the Bourbons. He was a tireless worker, often dictating 3 different letters to 3 different secretaries at once. Napoleon's continental blockade was a double-edged sword, fostering a new industrial spirit in France to replace British goods. He turned Paris into a construction site, building the Rue de Rivoli to make the city worthy of an empire. His Grande Armée utilized the Corps d'Armée system, mini armies that could move independently. He was famously superstitious, believing in his star. In Poland, he fell in love with Countess Marie Walewska, who remained loyal to him even in exile. Napoleon's Treaty of Schönbrunn in 1809 brought Austria to its knees. He revolutionized bridge building. His engineers, the pontonniers, were the unsung heroes of his campaigns. The King of Rome, his son, never saw his father again after 1814. Napoleon's Peninsular War was the first time he faced the nationalist spirit of a people. He was a pioneer of the mobile hospital and improved battlefield medicine. Napoleon's relationship with Tsar Alexander I was a tragic romance of 2 emperors who admired each other but were forced into war. He introduced the lycée system, ensuring that the brightest minds were trained. His Grand Sanhedrin of 1807 was a historic attempt to integrate Jewish citizens. Napoleon's invasion of Russia was a logistical nightmare. He required 9,000 supply wagons on roads that could not support them. The fire of Moscow destroyed 75% of the city. At the Berezina, his engineers worked in chest-deep freezing water to build bridges. The Battle of Hanau in 1813 showed that even in retreat, Napoleon could smash an army. During the 6 Days Campaign of 1814, he moved so fast the Allied generals thought there were 3 different Napoleons. His abdication was marked by a tearful farewell to his old guard. On Elba, he escaped by painting his ship to look like a British vessel. The Congress of Vienna was interrupted by the news of his return. At Waterloo, the sun of Austerlitz did not shine. A heavy rain turned the field into a quagmire. The British squares were unbreakable. Wellington's men stood through 11 charges. Napoleon's surrender to Captain Maitland was a calculated move to seek political asylum. The HMS Northumberland took him to St. Helena. At Longwood House, he was troubled by rats but maintained the etiquette of the imperial court. He dictated his Memorial de Sainte-Hélène, which turned his defeat into a moral victory. Napoleon's death was officially attributed to stomach cancer. His last words, France, the army, Josephine, summarized his life. When his body was exhumed in 1840, it was found perfectly preserved. The Arc de Triomphe stands as a gateway to his legend. His Code Civil was adopted by over 40 countries. Napoleon taught the world that the impossible is a word found only in the dictionary of fools. He broke the divine right of kings, showing that a commoner could wear a crown. Modern Europe is his shadow. He remains the standard by which all military commanders are measured. He was a man who lived 1,000 lives in one. The legend of Napoleon Bonaparte is about the spirit of an age where everything seemed possible. The eagle has landed for the last time.